Thank you, Kevin, and good morning, everyone. I've called this seabirds, elephants and satellites, and I hope by the end of this you'll understand why I've used these three terms. If you don't, then I've utterly failed. A few weeks ago, my wife and I were watching a boil-up of small fish off Milford Beach. As usual, the fish were attracting species such as terns, but in amongst those were thousands of smaller birds flying from each part of the boil-up in different directions, almost like locusts. They were these guys, fluttering shearwaters. Some of you probably have seen them forming very large masses or rafts in the Hauraki Gulf. When I was a student working 40 years ago, plus 40 years, plus actually, in the islands in the Gulf, we never saw these. So something is happening in the Gulf, and it's something happening that's quite good. So I want to talk today about why the appearance of these birds is significant, what changes have been undertaken to make these sightings possible, and why they're just the beginning. Is it switched on? We've lost a lot. Thank you. We've missed one, but I just want to point out before I get on to the main part of the talk that four rather remarkable students have actually contributed some of the information for these. And going from right to left on your screen, Lindsay Rankin, who is a student that we jointly co-supervise with Northern Illinois University, Rachel Buxton, Steph Burrell, who you'll be meeting shortly, and Joshua Thorison. All of them are either in the process of completing their PhDs or have already done so. The seabird diversity and biomass in the Hauraki Gulf is dominated by burrowing species. And those species are called by ecologists ecosystem engineers. In effect, they're rather like elephants. And if you go onto an island that's got lots of seabirds on it, you'll see what looks like elephant damage. Trees leaning in drunken angles, great footholds all over the place, except those footholds are burrow entrances. So when you go to the islands, you're probably not going to see something that looks like that. The seabirds have a trick that elephants don't have, and that is that they modify the composition of the soil, so they modify soil chemistry. And they do that by raising the nutrient content of the soil through their guano, and their guano also lowers the soil pH. So soils on seabird islands have very high nutrient content and very low pH. Internationally, seabirds are amongst the most endangered species of vertebrates. And they face a sort of a perfect storm. At sea, there are massive losses due to inappropriate fishing methods, and those losses were particularly high up to the 1990s before the UN banned the use of these pelagic drift nets. And of course, they also face issues with ingestion of rubbish. So what I'm going to do is just point out that when I went to check the super predator site on the net, this is what I got. The super predators, actually what I would expect to get would have been something looking like these. So cats have already been mentioned, but super predators are identified as species that consume or kill far more than they need for their daily requirements. So you can see why all three images actually have something in common. So there's two kinds of predators on many of these islands that affect seabirds. The first is the super predators, and the second are what you might call small sneaky predators. And these are things like rats. So we know cats eat rats. The problem is that the two of them form this kind of nasty alliance where rats eat seabird eggs and chicks, and cats eat the seabird nest and chicks and adults, but also far more than they actually need, or kill far more than they need. Certain times of the year, of course, the seabirds leave to feed at sea. And at that point, the cats switch back then to feeding on rats. So this rat-cat relationship is now responsible for about half of the world's most endangered seabirds. So what have we done about this? Well, we've got some technical advances that have helped with this. And the person who was really responsible for some of them, although he wasn't aware of it's going to be affecting us so much, was another Clinton. I'll come back to Bill Clinton in a minute, but there are two kind of advances that have made a huge impact on what we can do. The first one is the development of bait spreading technologies, and that is the development of baits that would go through machinery, and secondly, the machinery that could spread the baits. And this is a photograph not based on islands, but based on the mainland, but the same kind of principle applies. What Bill Clinton did was he took the wobble out of GPS. Okay, so the military in the US had a scrambling device that made it impossible for civilians to use GPS. What Clinton did was he removed that. As a result of Clinton's actions, we now have sat-nav systems in our cars. But what he also did was enabled us to very precisely define where baits would be laid, how much would be laid, and the direction on the flight paths of the helicopters that were laying it. And one of the advances that's come out of that kind of technology is something that some of you have already seen already. You can get these tracks of seabirds based on very accurate plotting of where the birds have been, and that's only possible because of GPS. So Bill Clinton is effectively the seabird's most important advocate. The increased GPS capability happened just as the aerial spread of baits was being developed. So we actually got the spreading devices before we got the GPS. And this graph shows the rate of change, or the cumulative area of islands cleared of invasive mammals in the Gulf. The aerial spread led to a big jump in the early 1990s, but when the GPS was reconfigured so that civilians could use it, that area shot up from about 2000 to the present day. The largest and most complex of the eradications in the Gulf have been made possible by this kind of technology, and that's Rangitoto Motutapu, with a combined area of 3,800 hectares and 8 different species of pests, all removed effectively in one operation. So within the Gulf, we actually have now about 22 islands that are cleared of all of invasive mammals, and the total area of those islands combined is bigger than the whole of Waiheke. Nationally, that area would involve, it is nearly 60,000 hectares and involves over 100 islands. And this has all been made possible largely because of a technology that had its infancies here in the Gulf, and that was the aerial spread of baits. So this first aerial spread operations that were conducted in New Zealand were in the Mokahinau's in the 1990s. So the Gulf has had a large part in developing technology that's now used internationally. So what happens as a result of these? Well, the first thing is that, as you would expect, if you remove the invasive mammals, the seabirds start to come back. And this is a picture of pie-crossed petrel. This particular species reappeared on Great Mercury Island about 3 years after the removal of mammals. And it's probably the first time that that particular species has landed unmolested on the island in perhaps 800 years. I'll come back to how seabirds can recolonise in a few minutes, but certainly within some parts of the Gulf, this is happening very rapidly. The other kind of change has been somewhat less direct. Some of the species suppressed by rats and cats include our native reptiles. But one of the things that assists in the recovery of some of these reptile populations is the development of honeydew as a result of honeydew scale. Honeydew scale is a parasitic insect that lives under the bark of trees. And you can see the little droplets of honeydew that gecko is going for coming out of the anal filament of the honeydew scale. And rats suppress honeydew scale, not so much by suppressing the individuals, but suppressing the host plants. So these are really indirect effects that we're now being able to see as a result of removing some of these predators. How widespread these indirect effects are have been studied by Joshua Thorison. And he found that if you compare islands with seabirds, compare them with seabirds compared with those without, that the food webs of invertebrates, so these are the smallest parts of the community, are way more complex on seabird islands than those that seabirds have been suppressed. And it's usually by suppression due to rodent predation. In fact, the least complex of the food webs he found on the seabird islands is just about as complex as the most complex as on the ones with no seabirds. So these indirect effects are just an indication of how wide and profound the effects of seabirds are on island ecosystems. But we now face a whole bunch of challenges that we have to deal with. In this work by Rachel Buxton and Steph Burrell have studied how far seabirds can go to naturally recolonise islands. And what Rachel found was that the absolute limit for many species is about 25 kilometres from the natural breeding site. And Steph has developed these, what we call recruitment halos, to show exactly what island groups are likely to provide new colonisers for neighbouring islands. So the henna chickens and the Mokohino Islands obviously cross over and can kind of recruit to each other. But notice with the two barrier islands that they're both right on the 25-kilometre limit. So it's more than likely that some species of seabirds will struggle to find their way there naturally. If you go further south, there's another recruitment halo around the Mercury Islands. If I go backwards through these, you'll see what's missing is a recruitment halo that covers the islands of the inner Gulf. So the natural recolonisation of many species of seabirds is actually probably going to proceed very rapidly in the outer Gulf, but may not proceed at all in the inner Gulf. So developing methods to encourage those birds to recolonise inner Gulf islands is one of the challenges we have to face. The second challenge is actually keeping the pests off the islands. So that's the challenge of biosecurity. So DOC deals with rodent incursions by using rodent-trained dogs. And this one has just been checking out Great Mercury to see if any rats were still present on the island. But these sorts of uses of dogs to track incursions is very expensive and time-consuming. The key to keeping predators off islands, in fact, is you people. It's the boating public who deal with the islands who need to be educated sufficiently to understand that the consequences of them accidentally carrying boats, either rats on boats, either close inshore or when they land. What we've got now is an unprecedented sort of resurgence of pest-free islands, and certainly we need to engage the public in this. And I just want to finish off to show you one particularly unexpected result that's been produced by Lindsay Rankin. When she studied the seaweeds around seabird islands and islands without seabirds, she discovered, A, that the diversity of seaweeds is significantly higher around seabird islands, but also 3 of the species of seaweeds contain evidence of enrichment, or nutrient enrichment, which obviously has flowed off the seabird islands. This has all kinds of implications. It could have implications for the way we design our marine reserves, because if the diversity of seaweeds is high, and if you compare that with what happens on land, the diversity of other communities will be high as well, because the seaweeds are sort of the base of the food chain. So to finish off with a bit of a quick summary, these are exciting times. We've now reached the point where the details of the engineering effects of seabirds are quite well known. We're able to reinstate these effects by removing predators. And there are recent advances to show how these will enable us to determine whether islands can be colonised or whether they can't. And really, the people now are going to have to answer the hardest question of all. How big can we get on eradications. And in fact, we know we're not there. We're not there yet, but it's certainly going to depend now on us working on inhabited islands, and that's going to involve people. If people do engage in this process, they themselves may get to see elephants with wings. Ngā mihi nui.